Hello, everyone. Today we're going to do some very quick review, and then we're going to dive into the background of the lottery. We're going to look at something called historicism as a lens for viewing literature, and we're going to discuss the text of the lottery and many other themes associated with the text. So first, the review, and this is important for both assignments that you'll be working on and for the final paper in this course. Themes from the allegory of the cave, the limits of perception, how the way we perceive the world could be wrong, and so we need to carefully study it and find out and challenge it to find the truth. The importance of enlightenment and education, how that we can only find it if on our own if we want to find it. Teachers can question and guide you, but ultimately you have to seek education, and that there will be a lot of hard steps along the way. You'll be challenged. It can sometimes be painful. It can sometimes cause you to be an outcast. It can sometimes make it so that you can't go home again in many ways. Then also creating how we create value systems. The idea that most of our value systems are arbitrary and made up, and many of them are unfair or unjust value systems. But yet we all constantly reinforce them anyway. Most importantly for this class, application of the cave as a metaphor, so that with nearly any topic, you can apply these theories to. So whether it be love, family, education, just about anything, if you look at and try to seek truth and try to see beyond what you've always known and be open to new information, that you could truly follow the path laid out in the allegory. So let's look at The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. First, a little background on Shirley Jackson. She was a famous writer in all of those publications that you see there. She published many short stories. She was known for having a tone that was odd, an impending sense of doom, and often framed by ordinary settings and characters. So strange, odd, impending sense of doom in an ordinary scene or setting, which I think you've seen in The Lottery. It was originally published in New Yorker magazine in 1948. It's generated more negative letters from readers than any story previous to that. Many canceled their subscriptions to the magazine, and readers were offended by the work and its suggestion that evil could be so easily and commonly carried out. They felt the stoning was pointless, arbitrary, and a violent sacrifice. So I want to emphasize here that to us, this is another Tuesday night on television. Whether it be a news broadcast now, or the newest episode of Criminal Minds, or some horror movie, right? This is on our screens, whether it be our phones, our laptops, our televisions, etc. We now have normalized this sort of pointless, arbitrary violence. At that time, even though it existed, a large portion of middle-class society, even some working-class society, were not as aware of this type of violence. It wasn't spread as far. The knowledge wasn't quite as available. So, for instance, if you look at kidnapping now, many parents in modern American society are paranoid about kidnapping. And if you were to look back at studies, parents 20, 30, 40 years ago were not as worried about kidnapping. even though back then it was much more likely for your kid to be kidnapped than it is now, right? So they just didn't have knowledge of those horrors, where now it's spread around the world lightning quick. Some people actually called to see where the town was so they could go and watch it. She received over 300 letters that summer alone, and we're talking long written out letters. And only 13 spoke kindly on the story. Even her own parents scolded her and said that all young people seem to think about is gloominess. Why not write something to cheer you up? So there was a harsh public reaction. She generally, like many authors, refused to explain the meaning of the story. But she did hint at it or come close, or at least talk about one aspect when she told a journalist, I suppose I hope by setting a particular brutal rite in the present and in my own village to shock the readers with a graphic demonstration of the pointless violence and general inhumanity of their own lives. But I gather that in some cases the mind just rebels. The number of people who expected Miss Hutchinson to win a Bendix washer at the end would amaze you. So when you're a modern reader who reads a story, is used to that a good portion of the time there's going to be a shocking ending. It's common to us now. And it's even increased a lot over the last decade or two to expect a graphic, shocking ending. But her readers wouldn't have gone in to the text with that expectation. At least the vast majority of them wouldn't have. So when a reader is tuning into the story, expecting a good outcome, and then it's brutal, shocking, it really is more disturbing than most horror stories would be to the modern reader. So we're going to view this text through the lens of historicism. It's a literary theory that focuses on major significance to specific context, such as historical period, geographical place, and local culture. It's a focus on context, understanding what was going on when this was written, and trying to interpret the events through that lens. Now, it's important to say, just like most literary theories, it's imperfect. So we can't get inside the author's head, and even when they tell us stuff, we don't know if they're lying. So we don't know how much the events of their time influence their writing. We also, even if they might not even know, it could be at the subconscious level. So if we were reading a text from around year 2001, it's a good idea to think, did 9/11 influence this writer in any way? And it's a good lens to interpret it from. Even if it didn't, there's a good chance it did. And so it's worth reading in that way. And because we talked about before, meaning in literature is both provided by the author and by the reader. It doesn't matter if we can ever prove 100%, as long as we're getting something out of the reading from this mode of literary theory. Some general background to the historical context. The president was Harry Truman. Population was less than half of what it is now. Life expectancy was about 10 years shorter. The GDP was a fraction of what it is now. The federal debt was a fraction. And the cost of a first-class stamp was 3 cents. There were some big events. The modern nation of Israel was created. Gandhi was assassinated. Truman ends segregation, right? So we'll talk about racial tensions. Big Bang Theory is proposed. and first monkey astronaut sent to the moon, so space exploration. So it's a time of science changing the world, a time of great racial and political tension. It's also a time where Americans greatly feared the spread of communism, leading to something called the Un-American Activities Committee, which was run by Joseph McCarthy. And there was a communist witch hunt trying to name and shame and do worse to people who were perceived to be communists. Formally, this didn't happen in 1950, but in 1948, the political era was already working on this. There's great fear of this, and if you had any sympathies at all to another mode of thought, you were labeled as a communist or blacklisted in many ways. Also, it's much closer to the horrors of something like lynching. We talked about racial tensions. And at this time, they were everywhere. So this was earlier. This was about 18 years earlier. But lynching was still going on, though at a much scaled back pace in 1948. But I think this is one of the most powerful historical reference in reference to the lottery because of this right here. These people standing here watching a lynching are just having a normal day. This couple looks like they're having a date. They're dressed up, they're holding hands, having a good old time. Sitting there having a good old time watching those horrors. And there's hundreds of pictures like this. You see children, you see people posing, and all excited to be part of this horror. This one I find particularly disturbing, just how happy this little girl looks. And so you can imagine a context like this would definitely seed a story like this, even if Shirley Jackson was unaware. And so even getting closer to 1948, senators filibustered for 6 weeks in Congress to block a vote on anti-lynching legislation, right? So it was okay to stand up in front of the nation and argue against anti-lynching legislation. Also, it was immediately following World War II, and it was a time where conformity was increasing. We were less connected in many ways in our little local communities. And conformity started increasing in many respects, especially with the spread of television. Now all of a sudden, Americans could all watch the same things and have the same conversations about the same issues, and narratives would be driven by that programming that would drive now conversations all around the country. This conformity expressed itself as through consumerism, the idea that we are what we buy, blind patriotism, which is a patriotism without respect to reality. Like always, true patriotism should do that realistically. Take pride in your country, but also recognize the faults. Blind patriotism decides to ignore the faults. And also, there was zealous traditionalism, just a fundamentalist view that we must maintain tradition at all costs. Also, news of Nazi concentration camps had finally reached America, so a few years earlier. So Americans were just horrified, and just everyone morally was trying to figure out how this could occur and how normal German people could allow this to happen. Also part of history is she's writing from a Christian country, a country where the vast majority of people consider themselves Christians. And so when we're looking at something like the lottery, it's pretty obvious that it's an allusion to the Gospel of John, when Jesus frees an adulterous woman, saying that whoever is without sin should cast the first stone, and no one throws stones at her. Unfortunately, in the lottery, no one plays the Jesus role, and so Tessie becomes the scapegoat and pays for the town's sin. This is a theme you'll see throughout literature of, in order for a society to move on and to progress, there must be a sacrifice of some sort. It's biblical, and it follows throughout our history and literature. Also, ancient ritual sacrifices have been a part of Western tradition throughout history. We're going to skip over some of that, but all the way throughout biblical times, and different kinds of sacrifices today, like giving up things for Lent and stuff like that. But it's part of our tradition. A theme that we'll see is ritual without meaning. Because there's always been a lottery, the villagers feel compelled to continue this horrifying tradition. We'll come back to these themes. Let's dive into the text. So, I apologize that this is a bit messy, but I think that, let me see if I can make this bigger. I think that I would do this differently if I was starting over, but I had already gone so far that I decided to just stick with this method of underlining and crossing out. We'll make do. Okay, so in your homework, I asked you to look at naturalism, and so, I'm sorry, I might have taken away that question, so we'll just take a quick look at it here. The morning of June 27th was clear and sunny, with the fresh warmth of a full summer day. The flowers were blossoming profusely, and the grass was richly green. All right. So if I was to give you those sentences there and tell you that write about what this story is going to be about. Without this background, I'm sure most people would write this was going to be a wonderful, good story, right? So in this case, nature is actually setting up a tension in mood, right? And we can see this throughout. So the children, and then all about the children's school was recently over. So we all know the good feelings that brings about. Now, there is a bit of foreshadowing here, right? It says, and the feeling of liberty sat uneasily on most of them, right? Uneasily. The freedom we think of leaving school for the summer, we don't often think of that as uneasy, right? That there's this eerie feeling. So it's all normal, great, normal, great, uneasy, right? Boisterous play, so it's great. But then we get this weird scene of he stuffed his pockets full of stones, and focus on the kinds of stones he picks out, right? We get stones repeated, stones repeated, and I could have kept highlighting. You'll see that everywhere. So there's this kind of slight hint that something's eerie, something's going wrong. But the majority still feels positive. So soon the men began to gather, surveying their own children, speaking of planting and rain, tractors and taxes. They stood together away from the pile of stones, there you go again, in the corner, and their jokes were quiet, and they smiled rather than laughed. Okay, so that second half of that sentence again. All pleasant, good, good, good. Wait, why were their jokes quiet? And why did they smile rather than laugh? Well, for foreshadowing purposes, to give you that everything's great, uneasy. Everything's great, uneasy feelings as you read. The lottery was conducted, as were the square dances, the teen club, and the Halloween program by Mr. Summers, who had time and energy to devote to civic activities. He was round-faced, jovial man, and he ran the coal business, and people were sorry for him, because he had no children and his wife was a scold. When he arrived in the square, carrying the black wooden box, there was a murmur of conversation among the villagers, and he waved and called, "Little late today, folks." The postmaster, Mr. Graves, followed him, carrying a three-legged stool, and the stool was put in the center of the square, and Mr. Summers set the black box down on it. The villagers kept their distance, leaving a space between themselves and the stool. Okay, let's unpack this a little bit. Again, normal. The lottery, what we all know is not so pleasant thing that's going to happen, is compared just like everything else, square dances, the teen club, Halloween, right? And the man who's running it is Mr. Summers, right? Summers, a happy, pleasant time, but we were just told it's also uneasy, right? Now, he runs the coal business, right? So somebody who is reading this text from what's called a Marxist viewpoint that looks at class structure, he would be one of the top social classes. He would be wealthy. A wealthy business person runs this activity. We get a black wooden box, which we'll see in a little while that like the box in Kugelmas is not exactly the best put together thing, right? And then I just want to point out some symbolism here. Anytime we get something that could be symbolic that has the number 3 in it, what we want to think of is the Trinity, that in Christianity, that it could represent in some way Christianity, in some way, or religion in general. So a three-legged stool holds up this box. So one way this could be read is religious tradition holds up this box, or a tradition that's like religious. Matter of fact, it's such an awe-inspiring thing, the villagers keep their distance and space. The original paraphernalia was lost a long time ago, and they had talked about making a new box, but decided to keep it because of tradition. It was shabby, it was splintered, and faded and stained. So very much just like the box in Kugelmas, perhaps foreshadowing that this isn't going to be a good box, right? That there's problems that are going to come from it. The ritual had been forgotten or discarded. They substitute wood for paper, which could be symbolic in the advancement of society or technology to go from wood to paper. The rest of the year, the box was put away in Mr. Graves' barn, underfoot at the post office, in the grocery. So it's such a tradition, it's such a thing that people don't even think about it much anymore. They just do it, act without thinking. Okay, let's pause on that for a moment. And I want to talk about that, this idea that we act without thinking. Okay, one way to think about that is how we all do that in our lives, right? Now, in some ways, it's a normal part of our lives, group or peer pressure, right? We all, our brain actually rewards us when we act like a group does, where it punishes us when we resist groups. So, in order to regularly resist groups, you actually have to retrain your brain. So we all do this in many ways. One way I want to look at this, though, is through social pressure, right? And there's many different kinds of social pressure. One, I think, is really got at by a philosopher named Michel Foucault. And he had this idea called the panopticon. I'll describe it a little bit to you, then I'm going to show you a short video clip that describes it more in depth. And we'll unpack it a little bit. And this is one of those things that, you might want to note it could be useful in your paper or future assignments. So the idea was that there was this prison. A engineer or architect named Jeremy Bentham designed this prison. And what it was similar to this right here. None of these are perfect representations, but this idea that there would be a guard tower in the middle, right? And the cells all around the outside. And what would happen, again, not a perfect representation, is that the guard tower originally would be full of guards, okay? And they'd be watching every single thing the prisoners do. And anytime a prisoner did something wrong, these guards would come out and severely punish them, beat them, do the worst punishments you can imagine. And so what Foucault determined or argued was that as time goes on, you could slowly start removing guards from the tower. That just the threat of that punishment will start to keep the prisoners in line. And he theorized that eventually there could be no guards in the tower and prisoners would still keep themselves in line. There's a lot of problems with this, and it's been debated, and it's effective in many ways, an ineffective way of thinking about social order. But the idea is Foucault then took this idea of this prison and argued that much of our society is built this way, that we're often acting certain ways, even though the people who originally got us to act that way are no longer in the guard tower. Let's look at, I think this video does a little better job than I do of explaining this, though we'll tread on some of the same territory. And so maybe between my explanation and this, you'll get the idea. And then this actually focuses on government coercion, but we're going to talk about other forms of coercion as well.
Series, a McCann analysis of Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish. How does a modern state ensure that it controls its citizens? Michel Foucault, a radical French social philosopher, sought to answer this question in his 1975 work Discipline and Punish. Foucault's book explores the evolution of power since the Middle Ages. Foucault's main argument is that modern states have moved away from enforcing their authority physically to enforcing it psychologically. To demonstrate his point, Foucault examines a new type of prison created by the British social reformer Jeremy Bentham. Bentham's panopticon was a circular prison with cells around the external walls and a watchtower erected in the center. The theory was that inmates would assume they were being watched and as a result would act accordingly, eliminating the need for many or any prison guards. This sort of self-governance is the linchpin of Foucault's theory of modern power. He argues that surveillance is being used in our modern institutions as a key instrument to control and govern the people. As Foucault was talking modern day, let's examine a modern concept, CCTV. How is it used to control and govern society? The presence of surveillance helps to catch those who break laws by recording their activity. But it works on another level too, as a deterrent. Have you ever felt like you're being watched? A pedestrian is less likely to drop litter, and a graffiti artist is less likely to spray paint a wall if they think they are being watched by CCTV. A driver is less likely to break the speed limit if he believes a police camera is snapping away. Whether or not the cameras are switched on is irrelevant. The mere presence of them is enough to influence the behavior of most people. Surveillance techniques are there to ensure societal rules are followed, but Foucault believed they have huge negative implications. He claimed that awareness of being observed stifled individuality and created conformity. People end up acting, thinking, and being the same for fear of being caught out or punished. Foucault calls this dynamic normalization. Foucault asserted that this dynamic normalization is fundamentally undemocratic because it ends up eradicating free will and independent thinking, creating a society of robots. Foucault thought that over time this would quell our instinct to think for ourselves, behave spontaneously, or develop original impulses or ideas. Foucault is considered to be one of the most influential thinkers of our time. Discipline and Punish is a compelling study of power and agency in the modern world. A more detailed examination of his ideas.
Okay, so I think that video in some ways does a better job than I could with that. I want to see quickly if I can find a video that I sometimes use that gets at another aspect of this. Yes, okay, here it is. So we think of or at least this video focused on government control, okay? So we think of prisons, asylums, schools, often use this idea. For instance, when I'm at UPT, I don't teach from on top of a desk, wearing just my boxers or something like that. Because even though that might be comfortable, it might be fun, right? I don't do it because Dr. Fitz, the dean, might be coming around, right? I might get fired. So my fear of those things makes me act a certain way. It's the reason why a room full of 30, 18 to 20-year-olds will sit there and listen to me drone on for an hour, right? Often because there's social control involved. And so here's an example in Pittsburgh. The Allegheny County Courthouse was designed with Foucault's panopticon in mind. But I want to focus on how it can go beyond government control. That Foucault argued that it's a psychology, right? That our brains start controlling us in the same way. So some examples are, we stop for a stop sign or street light in the middle of the night, even in places where we know there's not going to be police officers. Taxes, the IRS could never, if we all decide to stop paying taxes tomorrow, the IRS doesn't have enough enforcement to hold us all accountable. The only way that we're pressured to do that is through the same idea. They punish a few people harshly, and then the rest of us just follow along. Things like illegal downloading, cheating, right? If everyone's trying to cheat, it's going to be very hard for someone like a professor to stop it. But if you punish harshly one person, it stops that. Things like the army and schools and any hierarchical organization run with elements of panopticonal thinking. Many parts of our government, many corporations, and it leads to things like we were just talking about, to the things like the witch trials, the Salem witch trials, the Nazis, Un-American Activities Committee, the Gestapo. It also leads to things like crime and terrorism and the purge, explosions of anarchy that result from too much panopticonal pressure, right? So, but let's look at a different level, the personal level, how it affects you and me, right? It does on that governmental level, it does in all the ways I just outlined, but how it really impacts you and me. So let's look at this video. It's a modern video that's shaped like an old psychological study, and I think it gives you an idea. We probably won't watch the whole thing, we'll just watch some of it.
Stella Artois has partnered with us at water.org to
after this advertisement.
Water to women and their families.
Hey, at least it's a good, positive advertisement.
Remembered for ending the global water crisis once and for all.
Okay, here we go.
To answer that question, we set up a hidden camera experiment to see if this woman would stand up at the sound of this tone, simply because everyone else is. You might be thinking you'd never go along with this. Or would you? After just 3 beeps, and without knowing why she's doing it, this woman is now conforming perfectly to the group. But what happens if we take the group away?
Let me just explain this, make sure everyone's got it. So the woman there in the purple, she's the only one who's not an actor at this point. The rest of them are actors who've been told to stand up every time there's a beep, and she starts standing up along with them.
Elaine, please.
Okay, now she's alone. The crowd is gone and nobody is watching her, except our hidden cameras. What do you think she'll do? She's now conforming to the rules of the group without them even being there. Now, watch what happens when we introduce another outsider who doesn't know the rules.
For a noon appointment. Have a seat and they'll be out in just a couple minutes. Great, thanks so much.
Everybody was doing it, so I thought I was supposed to.
Think she'll teach the new guy what to do? We kept the cameras rolling as more unsuspecting patients arrived. And slowly but surely, what began as a random rule for this woman has now become the social norm for everyone in this waiting room. Here to explain what's going on in their brains is Jonah Berger of the University of Pennsylvania.
This sort of internalized form of herd behavior is part of what we call social learning. Starting at a very early age, when we see members of our group perform a task, our brains literally reward us for following in their footsteps.
When I saw everybody stand up, I felt like I needed to join them. Otherwise, I'm like excluded. Once I decided to go with it, then I felt much more comfortable.
Conformity is how we become socialized, but it can also cause us to develop bad habits or repeat past wrongs.
And it's why even this rebel, who wasn't standing for any of this nonsense, eventually joined the ranks. And the only thing more shocking than seeing how easily conformity affects the way...
Okay, so this is based on an old psychological study called the Ash experiment. And what it shows is how easily our brains are fooled by group activity. That we strongly want to associate and assimilate with a group, and that our brains reward us for doing so, right? So what happens is that as that happens, we end up doing a lot of things that we previously thought we never would do because of those reward centers. And people who actually do avoid that type of group mentality often do it because of an association with another group. Like they create an association with a group that, a different kind of group. Or some actually retrain their brains to try to resist that. Some ways that this has played out in our history is, I'll just try to give you the brief explanation of this, but the ways we can see it in our everyday life started around the same time period. So this guy here, Edward Bernays, he was the minister of propaganda in World War I. He's Sigmund Freud's nephew. And his job was to go into Europe and explain how amazing Americans are and that we want to spread freedom and democracy around the world and to convince Europeans of that. And so he developed propaganda techniques. After World War I, and for the next 50, 60 years of his life, he comes back from war, comes back to the United States and says, well, what do I do with this? And what he decides is to shop himself around to different corporations. And to those corporations, he says, I can convince groups of people to do anything. So what do you want to pay me to convince people to do? Right? Now, and he uses this group mentality to convince us of things that are now just common everyday things, but they weren't before Edward Bernays. So, and this is all based on Freudian theories, of which Freud, when he figured out how easily groups were manipulated, became despondent, and he became depressed and went away for a couple of years. His nephew Bernays, when he found this out, he celebrated and decided, how can I get rich from this, right? So one of the first things he did was cigarette manufacturers. Women would not smoke no matter what they did. And so the cigarette manufacturers said, we really need women to smoke. And so he said, easy. At that time, women's suffrage was an important issue, the right, earning the right for women to vote. And so he said, you need to do two things. You need to attach cigarettes to that freedom and that suffrage movement. And also, because it's Freudian in nature, he also believed, just like his uncle, that it needed to be tied into our sexuality, right? So what he did is he hired a bunch of suffragettes in the middle of the Macy's Day Parade, and he notified all the newspapers, all that. And in the middle of the Macy's Day Parade, they hike up their skirts, pull cigarettes out from their garters, and they light them up and point them towards the sky. And so he told all the newspapers that those were freedom torches, and that women were promoting and showing their freedom and their resistance to male control. And so from Freudian theory, it's metaphorical, taking hold of a metaphorical penis, right? This idea of taking power from men, right? He did the same thing with, and within 1 to 2 years after that, women were smoking at the same rate as men. Slight, or at least really close. Then same thing, wealthy people would buy a bunch of clothes, but middle class and working class and poor people would not. They would have usually 3 outfits, something to work in, something for every day, and something for dress, right? And that was all they needed. And so clothing companies said, how do we get working, poor, and middle-class people to buy more clothes? And so what Bernays said, you need to tie your clothing to who you are, to your identity, and convince them that they are what they wear, right? So he hired all these famous people, all these models and actors and actresses, and they'd go out and promote these lines of clothes, and they would hold media events, and they would say, my clothing symbolizes who I am. How would anybody know who I am or without these clothing? And these clothing make me, great in all these different ways. Well, within a few years, poor working class and middle class people were buying clothes at similar rates as the wealthy. And so now even those of us who don't buy a lot of clothes often still have a closet full of clothing, right? Same thing with cars as a symbol of masculinity or sexuality. So car makers wanted, every family would have one car, but what car makers wanted was to get people to buy more than one car. They wanted people to buy fancier cars. They wanted people to buy all different add-ons to cars. And so they went to Edward Bernays, and Bernays said, you need to attach it to their masculinity, attach it to their sexuality and their identity. And so what they did is they started masculinizing cars. And he did all these campaigns. Like if you watch the advertisement from those times, it's so clear that they're making sexual references about masculinity and saying that you are only as manly as your car or truck. To the point where now you go driving down the street in any given point, and you're bound to come across a pickup truck with a big pair of truck nuts, right? And once you know it, car sales exploded. He also used Freudian theories for things like celebrity endorsements and product placement, right? And that now are just normal. Product placement was purely psychoanalysis for products. So how does this all come back to the lottery? So let's go back to the text and let's connect back with the reading. So we have this tradition that's not even thought of anymore, that people just enact and do without thinking. Stuff like buying a closet full of clothes, buying a car to symbolize your masculinity or to show off. Now there's even cars that show off femininity, right? And we don't even remember why we're buying a closet full of clothes, why we're buying cars in that way, why we're doing all these things. We just do them, right? So Another kind of last funny little example is Betty Crocker went to Edward Bernays and said, "We can't get women to buy cake mix." And when we do these tests to figure out why, they always say they feel guilty, that they're not doing enough work. So Bernays' formula, tie it to their identity and their gender, right? And their sexuality. And so he said, simple. Have them add an egg. An egg is symbolic of female sexuality. It makes them feel like they're doing something extra, right? Doing a little more work. And immediately, Betty Crocker cake mix took off. And to this point in history, the vast majority of Betty Crocker cake mix, you still have to put an egg in, right? Even though we don't, they could easily make it without that requirement. And it's, but we keep doing it because at some point, someone like Edward Bernays told us to do it. And we don't even know why, we just keep doing it. There were the lists to make up of heads of families, heads of households in each family, members of each household in each family. Okay, so they're talking about traditional patriarchal families with the father as the head of the household, right? So this ritual's tied up in patriarchal society. There had been a recital of some sort performed by the official of the lottery. So something like the Star-Spangled Banner or any of our patriotic songs, America the Beautiful, etc. There had been a ritual salute. So like a pledge to the flag, right? If you ever go by to another culture and witness them do these sorts of pledges, it can sometimes feel eerie or weird or strange. But in your own culture, it just feels normal, right? So now this is where we start thinking allegory of the cave, right? In our own cultural cave, all this stuff feels normal. If you're outside of the cave looking in, some of it can seem strange or weird, or why are all these people doing this? Why are people putting egg in Betty Crocker even though they don't have to, right? It's so normalized, this whole tradition, that Miss Hutchinson clean forgot what day it was, right? So just completely normalized this horrific tradition. Here's another kind of, they grinned at one another humorously and nervously, right? So kind of that eerie feeling that Shirley Jackson's creating here. Then we have, they do say, Mr. Adams said to Old Man Warner, who stood next to him, that over in the North Village, they're talking about of giving up the lottery. Old Man Warner snorted. Pack of crazy fools, he said. Listening to the young folks, nothing's good enough for them. Next thing you know, they'll be wanting to go back living in caves. So I doubt that Shirley Jackson was purposely alluding to a cave here for our purposes, right? But boy, is it fitting. Next thing you know, they'll be wanting to go back into living in caves. Nobody work for it anymore. Live that way for a while. Used to be a saying about lottery in June, corn be heavy soon. First thing you know, we'll all be eating stewed chickweed and acorns, so being poor. There's always been a lottery, he added. Bad enough to see young Joe Summers up there joking with everybody. Some places have already quit lotteries, Miss Adams said. Nothing but trouble in that, Old Man Warner said stoutly. Pack of young fools. And so what we have here is you could take this few paragraphs out and insert almost any tradition or ritual that we have, right? That we don't think about anymore. That we're just kind of programmed to do without thinking. So an example of that, how about wedding traditions, right? What a lot of people don't think about with weddings is it's changed a lot over the last 50, 60 years. For most of human history, weddings were much more transactional. It was much more, the woman was viewed as property, and the man and his family were purchasing that property, right? So they'd pay a dowry, right? And the woman would need to be a virgin because that property needs to be unsoiled, right? Well, and on and on. Well, today we enact a lot of these traditions that are based in this whole property-based tradition, but most of us don't know that that's why we do it, right? So the bride's family pays for the wedding, which is the same as the dowry was. Father gives away the daughter as if he's giving away his the object for sale, right? White wedding dress symbolizes virginity, so the product, the item, is unspoiled. Woman takes the man's name, so gives up her own identity and takes on the identity of her new legal owners, right? The veil, used as a wrapping, right? And the husband opens up his object, his present, right? The ring, symbol of ownership, she now belongs to him, right? Asking in-laws for permission is part of that property transaction. Waiting for the wedding night was a tradition to ensure the bloodline, right? So now we might not do it for these reasons anymore, but we still mindlessly enact all the traditions based in a property transaction for marriage. And so it's very similar to what is going on here in the story. And we could do that with many, many traditions we do that we don't think about anymore. Okay. And that there's always resistance to change, that people don't want to change, that they don't want to give it up, right? Okay, so let's try to get to the ending here. So Tessie and her family is now picked out, right? You didn't give him time enough to take any paper he wanted. I saw you. It wasn't fair. So now that she's going to be her family's going to be affected by this tradition, well, now she questions it, right? Up until this point, she didn't question it. It's not until it was going to impact her that all of a sudden she starts to question that tradition. And the rest of the people just mindlessly mock the tradition or enforce the tradition. It wasn't fair, again, only questions it when it turns out against her. I think we should start over. I tell you, it wasn't fair. You didn't give him enough time to choose, right? Questioning tradition only because it's going to literally take a life. Otherwise, you just mindlessly mimic tradition like everyone else here is. It's not the way it used to be. People ain't the way they used to be, right? This is something we hear all the time in society nowadays. Let's just go back to the good old days, right? Or more recently, make America great again, right? And I always tell people, you know what? The good old days never existed, right? There wasn't a time in our history that was just good, right? The 1950s, that's often pointed to by film and movies in Hollywood. Well, it wasn't nice if you were a woman. You were still had almost no rights. You were treated as property. Often a regular practice in the 50s was that if you were abused, it was considered a family matter and should be left up to the family to fix. And that even women who died would often be ruled accidental just because it was a family affair. It wasn't a good old days if you were fearing being lynched or experiencing prejudice right, as a minority group or an African American in the U.S. So we always view things like the good old days. It's fiction, right? But we all long for it, or a lot of people anyways long for it. Let's see, it had a black spot on it. It had a black spot Mr. Summers made the night before with heavy pencil in the coal company office. Bill Hutchinson held it up and there was a stir in the crowd. Okay, so very symbolic there. A black spot. Black often symbolizes death, right? So very symbolic. Although the villagers had forgotten the ritual and lost the original black box, they still remembered to use the stones. The pile of stones the boys made. So all that foreshadowing is starting to come into play. And the Delacroix selected a stone so large she had to pick it up with both hands and turned to Miss Dunbar. "Come on," she said. "Hurry up." Now that's more powerful than we think, because I'll mention this quickly in a few minutes here, that most of the names in this story are symbolic. Delacroix is French for "of the cross," right? And so literally the person who's throwing the largest stone is the person named "of the cross." And so it's a commentary on religion being perverted for horrible things. The children had stones already. Again, those children from the lynching pictures, the eeriness and normality of violence and evil. And someone gave little Davy Hutchinson a few pebbles. Tessie Hutchinson was in the center of a clear space by now, and she held her hands out desperately as the villagers moved in on her. "It isn't fair!" A stone hit her on the side of the head. Old Man Warner was saying, come on, everyone." Steve Adams was in the front of the crowd of visitors with Mr. Graves, or Miss Graves, beside him. "It isn't fair, it isn't right," Miss Hutchinson screamed, and then they were upon her. Okay, I'm going to try to go over the rest of this quickly because I know this video is getting pretty long. And let's see what we can do here. So there's a ton of symbolism, right? And that's one reason why I think this text is important for us to use. So it gets you thinking about that in future texts, right? Black is the color for death, mourning. Black box could be a coffin, right? Stones, universal symbol for punishment, burial, martyrdom. Then the names are symbolic. So Tessie Hutchinson, most likely an allusion to Anne Hutchinson, American religious enthusiast who founded the Puritan colony of Rhode Island. She had new theological views which opposed her to other ministers. She was a female activist in a time when that was unacceptable. After a local trial banished her, she was tried before the Boston Church and formally excommunicated and would die soon after. So Tessie in the story, trying to argue against tradition, a female trying to stand up in a patriarchal society, ends up dead like Anne Hutchinson. We already talked about Delacroix. Summers, the season of summer associated with youth, strength, happiness, etc., etc. But he's the head of a coal business, right? Which can symbolize coal comes from deep within the earth, right? So lurking just below the surface. It's also, we talked about how he's a person in power, right? Graves, obvious. A dark undertone, a person connected with a grave. Serious, kind of like gravely, right? Adams, reference to the first man, the first sinner, right? Like the biblical Adam, Mr. Adams goes along with the sin. He follows others into evil. Old Man Warner, representing resistance to change. He's 77 years, and you could go into symbolism around the number 7. Probably last for this text, I just want to mention psychoanalytic criticism, since we've been talking about Freud. And it adopts the methods of reading employed by Freud and later theorists to interpret texts. It argues that literary texts, like dreams, express secret, unconscious desires and anxieties of the author, and that a literary work is the manifestation of an author's own neurosis. So the key here is unconscious desires and anxieties. Fears, angers would be with that too. But you read a text and search for unconscious desires, fears, anxieties, right? Kind of like if you interpreted a dream. You would interpret a text in that way. And you could also interpret an author in that way, and interpret it through a psychoanalytic look at the author's life and the text, right? So again, you look for unresolved emotions, psychological conflicts, guilt. You look for childhood trauma, family life, sexual conflicts, anything that could be traced through characters. And again, this is a very, very iffy interpretation, but it can help us learn about an author, a text, a time period, and look at a text in a different way. Symbolism is very similar to dream interpretation, right? The repressed object represented in disguise is how psychoanalytic critics would look at it. So if we were to look at Shirley Jackson's life through this lens, we can see that her life has a lot of impact on her writing. She didn't have a peaceful early life. She preferred to stay in her room and write poetry rather than play with other children. Her college life, she dropped out and was put in a mental institution. She married a Jewish intellectual who encouraged her to rebel. He also encouraged her to become a severe critic who smoked too much, ate too much, and used drugs, right? And you could try to connect that to her life, her works, and continue to analyze her work in this way. The lottery is throughout literary traditions. It's also throughout our popular culture. One of the most common, most recent would be the Hunger Games, with the reaping. Some very interesting analysis comparing the Hunger Games to the lottery. And it's throughout our culture, though. It's an idea that's taken hold, and you'll see it represented in many different ways. Okay, so I want you to continue thinking how allegory of the cave is symbolic of the lottery. We've mentioned it a lot in this discussion, but I think there's a lot more to that. And perhaps that's something you might want to take some notes on for the final paper in this class, is how the allegory relates to the lottery. So you can go now and take this quiz. Thank you. And